Welcome, everyone. My name is Aaron DeVore, and I am the chair in Transgender Studies and your host for today's talk. Thank you all for coming. We start with a territorial acknowledgement at the University of Victoria, and we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We are the world's first and only chair in Transgender Studies. We work to provide inspiration and hope to transgender people wherever you may be, and to our allies wherever you may be. We contribute to the development and communication of accurate and research-based real-world knowledge about trans plus people, and we want to see that used to build a better world that has better policies, better laws, and to drive social change. We also help to build strong and resilient trans plus social and cultural communities and individual well-being, and we do that through arts, cultural, and social activities. And in everything that we do, we are committed to applying an intersectional lens in our work to advance reconciliation, racial justice, equity, and inclusion for all. So, in addition to events like today's, we also do a lot of other things. We help and promote, and I founded the world's largest transgender archives. We host the international, interdisciplinary, and intergenerational biennial Moving Trans History Forward conferences. Everybody is invited. And we have a variety of scholarships and fellowships for UVic students, for visitors, and as I mentioned a moment ago, arts and cultural events. All right, so those are my introductory remarks, and I'm going to give you a short bio of our speaker, Ellis Kokko, and invite them up to the podium to give us their presentation. So Ellis Kokko is a non-binary community activist and a PhD candidate in social anthropology at Edinburgh University. They're working on an ethnographic history of the suffering transgender subject. That's in quotation marks, the suffering transgender subject. Examining how shifting ontologies of suffering have held a central role in making trans lives and selves intelligible. Their research centers around the question of victimhood, identity, and the intangibility of trans futures. Alongside their PhD, they also run a queer outdoor project and are working towards becoming a counselor. The title of the talk is "We Must Protect the Children." That's in quotation marks. And then subtitle, "Transgender Suffering and Its Limits in the UK's Bell versus Tavistock court case." So please join me in welcoming Ellis Kokko.
Today, I'll be talking about my PhD research project on the politics of transgender suffering. And what I'm going to present now is kind of a in-progress draft of a paper that I'm working on. So be nice and patient with me. And yeah, I'm thinking it would be really, really nice also to hear your thoughts and feedback and kind of make it into a space of us to reflect on these questions together. I will start by talking a little bit about the wider research project and the background of how it got started, and then move on to discussing the Kira Bell court case in the UK, which is kind of a nice exemplification of some of the themes in my research. So my research project is about the role of suffering in constitution of trans subjectivities and the unintended, often paradoxical consequences that this has on trans lives and politics today. So I combine historical archival research with multi-sited ethnographic fieldwork in the UK. So in the historical part, I'm kind of first tracing the history of these narratives. And then in the second part, asking what are the political effects when we make the alleviation of suffering the moral basis of claims for transgender justice. In particular, I'm focusing on the narrative that kind of creates a link between mental ill health and transgender people. And this kind of higher rates of different mental health problems among trans populations is now a widely known fact that is backed up by more than a decade of research studies, public health agendas, social justice campaigns that highlight the impact of stigma and discrimination on mental health of trans people. And kind of in the 15, 20 years, narratives of psychological distress and victimhood have indeed become an inseparable part of public discourses around transgender equality in the UK, and more globally as well. And we see statistics such as 41% of transgender people have attempted suicide at some point in their lives, kind of circulate in academic research, in media and activist spaces to back up claims for transgender rights. And crucially, this language of mental health has not only been adopted by trans activists, but also various medical professionals and institutions, public health programs, and sympathetic politicians. What's happening? Oh. So I just put two quotes here. So the first one is from a World Health Organization briefing paper around the 11th version of the International Classification of Diseases, which after years and years of activist struggles, finally in 2018 removed transgenderism from the list of mental illnesses. And the second quote is from the former Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, in her kind of speech of justifying the proposed reforms the government wanted to make to the process of legally confirming your gender in Scotland. And I've just put these two quotes here to kind of illustrate the kind of politics I'm talking about, where we can kind of see this idea of like, okay, we need to make this change. We're making this claim for equality because people are suffering, people are like psychologically distressed, and we need to help them. And this idea that the cause of mental suffering is found in society rather than in the individual psyche, and that psychological effects should indeed be a key focus when we talk about marginalization, has not been part of mainstream public thinking for very long. And of course, this narrative is like arguably a positive shift away from an inherently pathologized subject. But in my research, I interrogate the history of this shift and, yeah, as I said, some of the unintended consequences that can follow. It's important to emphasize that the question I'm addressing here is not whether marginalization leads to psychological distress or what the best or most authentic way of describing transgender suffering would be. Rather, I am interested in quoting Foucault, how a particular truth has been established as the arrangement of domains where the practices of the true and the false can be at once regulated and relevant. I'm paraphrasing the French social anthropologist Didier Fassin, who writes about the history and genealogy of the category of trauma. I'm seeking to understand the shift from a realm in which the anguish of the trans persons were seen as of doubtful legitimacy to one in which their suffering invokes sympathy and demands action, like Fassin in his genealogy of the trauma victim, to grasp the historic moment when suspicion ended, or perhaps more accurately in the case of transgender people, when it at least drastically decreased. To answer this question, it's necessary to approach transgender suffering not only as a matter of medical definition or a political issue, but as a moral question. None of this, of course, means ignoring the real embodied subjective experiences of distress that animate these discourses that I'm studying. Just when doing the research for the Kira Bell case that I'll be talking about soon, it's hard to capture the sense of anxiety and fear that came through in my conversations with parents, activists, lawyers, and clinicians connected to the case. But I believe there's already enough narratives of such suffering, and there's a lot of kind of stories about this, which in itself then shapes the politics in question. So in my research project, I'm trying to tell a different kind of story and address different kind of questions. And then as a transgender researcher writing about transgender suffering, there's kind of a lot of ethical questions and ethics of research that I have been reflecting on, doing research on transgender subjects, being aware of many criticisms, such as the one made by Vivienne Namaste about kind of academic research using the lives and bodies of trans people for producing theory in a way that removes the subject from their full humanity and reduces these complex lives into abstract questions, which prioritizes the need and interest of the researcher. And I recently read the great book, The Transgender Issue, by the writer and activist Shona Fay. And she mentions there kind of this pressure that trans writers often have to stay kind of on the sphere of the personal and the anecdotal, with the assumed incapacity to speak to the universal, abstract, and theoretical levels of debate. And I'm bringing this up because I've been thinking about these questions a lot myself, and I believe this is kind of a trap of the suffering paradigm that I will be talking about, of not being able to escape this question of legitimacy and the question of validity of the knowledge we produce, especially vis-a-vis to kind of the outside world or the cis world. And kind of we can't step outside the question of, or like outside of this long history of epistemic violence that has been directed at trans people. And rather than avoid these questions, I believe we should engage with them as researchers and activists as directly as we can. And as an example of the kind of tensions that follow, like it felt really important for me when I started, kind of from a personal ethical perspective, that I did not want to make trans people the object of my study. So I specifically, when I started recruiting for interviews, I was like, yeah, I want to speak to people who professionally engage with transgender mental health. Let's say that, like, they don't have to identify as trans themselves. But then, like, obviously it was only trans people who answered to any of my emails. And as a result, a lot of my interlocutors have been kind of trans-identified professionals in these double roles, which in itself, I think, opens up new interesting avenues of research. Just quickly, in terms of language, I'm using trans as an umbrella term in a broad sense, but it's important to note that I am very specifically writing about the particular modern Western or Anglo-European understanding of transness, and I don't focus on other forms of gender diversity in other historical periods or cultural contexts. So when researching this form of transness, it's very much about race and class, and it's a form of configuration that's also steeped in whiteness. I will talk a bit about the historical research and kind of where I've been trying to find out where this notion of suffering as a defining feature of trans identity emerges and how it has shifted. Oh, those were just my research questions. Forgot about them. Yeah, moving on. Yes, so how it has shifted through different periods. So I use the term the suffering transgender subject to refer the kind of dominant formulations of transgender identity that shift over time. And the suffering paradigm is a particular politics of victimhood that makes the alleviation of personal suffering the key justification and moral basis for equality, while representing this suffering in quantifiable, comparable terms. And this is attached to mainstream trans politics, but as I said before, it's importantly formed through kind of various, sometimes conflicting sites and bodies, which could include medical and public health institutions, universities, NGOs, and so on. So although the evolution of diagnostic criteria of transgenderism and their relationship to evolving ideas of pathology, gender, and sex has been well documented, what has received less attention is the continued role of suffering in the changing definitions of transness. The dominant medical narrative constructed by experts in the first gender identity clinics in the US did not only construct the transsexual in pathological binary terms, it also made trans experience contingent on a particular kind of suffering subject, one whose distress was intense, consistent, and clearly separate from any other causes of anguish. It's quite interesting because this distress was not actually always part of the medical descriptions of what transness entails. And we can kind of see the shift in the medical understanding of the trans person, even though they were not using that word at the time, from this kind of adventurous bohemian spirit to what Harry Benjamin calls the most unhappy person in the world in relation to kind of in the context of surgery becoming slightly more widely available in the and the first gender identity clinics being set up in the US. And today, clinically significant distress or impairment continues to be a key aspect of the diagnosis of gender dysphoria in the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders by the American Psychological Association. And in challenging this medical model of transpathologization, trans activists have also sought to re-narrate the nature of transgender suffering. Rather than an inner pathology, the source of the distress is external, violence, discrimination, oppression. And such claims of victimhood have been central to establishing trans people as morally legitimate victims and right-bearing subjects. The way transgender activists have mobilized suffering and victimhood to advance equality is, of course, not a unique strategy, but endemic to contemporary liberal rights discourse. Wendy Brown has argued that progressive movements coalesce around wounded identities that function as the moral basis of their claims. She furthermore argues that such tactics result in the construction of wounded subjecthoods, meaning that these marginalized groups can only be understood as victims whose only hope lies in the hands of the state that is summoned to their rescue. Inadvertently, these narratives have therefore continued to make transgender experience and subjecthood intimately connected to notions of suffering and victimhood. And in the kind of 2000 period, drawing on such narratives, advocates in the UK and US were successful in gaining some victories in terms of revising the trans healthcare model and for social and legal recognition of a wider spectrum of gender variance. However, while the early 2000s anti-violence campaigns dominated trans activism, more recently mental health has arisen to be kind of a key framing through which trans suffering is made intelligible. This narrative focusing on mental health and psychological distress has two strategic benefits, I think, for trans rights advocates. So first, psychological injury represents a broader form of victimhood to place claims on than what is captured by physical violence. While physical violence will never affect most trans people, a point that has been increasingly acknowledged and criticized, especially by transgender activists of color, anyone can be impacted by poor mental health. Mental health is construed as an essential human condition, giving meaning to what it means to be psychologically well or unwell. By claiming this form of psychological injury, trans advocates are able to adopt a non-pathological language of distress based on an idea of a shared universal humanity. In addition to this goal of recognizing trans people as right-bearing subjects whose suffering demands a moral response, kind of a second aspect of this suffering paradigm I'm talking about is it's a particular epistemological approach. And I think this is because historically, the medical model of transness has been so prevalent and powerful in defining transness, and transgender activism has kind of always been or had to be very kind of concerned with the question of who has the authority to produce knowledge that is seen as legitimate in order to break this age-old relationship of epistemic dependence. And the kind of solution of the suffering paradigm to this question is the idea that the key to liberation is rooted in science, research, and objective knowledge. Kind of the production of data in itself holds a promise. The challenge is to get wider, more accurate data to make a rational argument for trans inclusion. Data and statistics on transgender experiences are produced by multiple actors, nationally and internationally. They can take the form of statistics on level of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. It's an example of what anthropologist Sally Engel-Merrick calls quantification, ways of turning social life and experiences into measurable and countable forms of knowledge to respond to growing demands of evidence-based policy and practice in all areas of public life. And this quantification is appealing precisely because it claims to stand above politics, offering rational technical knowledge that is disinterested and the product of expertise, an objective description of matters as they are. This can be strategically employed by activists to shield against accusations of ideology and lack of objectivity that are often invoked when disenfranchised groups make demands for social justice. But in seeking to legitimize itself, the very logic of the suffering paradigm creates a number of paradoxes. for research on trans experiences to be legitimate, it also has to be distant from transness as a subjective experience. Furthermore, to make things known, they must be countable. Therefore, things that evade quantification and are difficult to turn into commensurable terms may remain unnoticed. I argue that while previously the suffering paradigm was able to garner some victories for some trans rights advocates, in the current political climate, it's not only failing to achieve justice, but it's being turned against transgender justice. I will then move on to analyzing the Tavistock court case to eliminate some of the unintended consequences that follow when the logic of the suffering paradigm is enacted in practice, showing how attempts to make the suffering of transgender youth intelligible and morally legitimate have not only failed in bringing about trans equality and justice, but have been turned against trans people. Oh yeah, this is images of statistics. Just have some more. So I'm sure all of you have probably heard of the case, but I don't know how familiar you are kind of with the details. So in September 2020, two claimants, Quincy Bell, known as Keira Bell, and Mrs. A, asked the courts to review the practice of prescribing puberty blockers, a form of drugs used to pause the physical changes of puberty, to patients under the age of 18 experiencing gender dysphoria. The target of this court case was the Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDS, a service that has been providing specialist assessment, consultation, care, and support for gender diverse adolescents and their families for over 20 years, based in London. The claimants argued the practice of prescribing puberty blockers was harmful and put children at considerable risk. In its ruling, the court stated that children under the age of 16 were unable to give informed consent, and those aged 16 and 17 were highly unlikely to be able to consent to puberty blocking treatment. Instead, a court decision would be required to determine the best interest of the child. The ruling effectively stopped the treatment of young trans people overnight, and the case profoundly shook the ground in terms of healthcare for transgender youth in Britain, as well as wider discussions of transgender equality. The specific questions the court addressed were whether children with gender dysphoria can ever be considered competent to consent to treatment, and if so, whether GIDS provided sufficient information to support informed consent. In other words, the consent of the young person and their caregivers, combined with the clinical expertise in diagnosing gender dysphoria, was ruled to be an insufficient basis for initiating treatment. As the court stated, the issue at the heart of the claim is whether informed consent in the legal sense can be given by such children and young persons. In arguing against the capacity of children to provide informed consent, the court emphasized unusual and experimental nature of the treatment, incomparable to any other forms of medical intervention, the lack of evidence about the benefits of blockers, and the severe long-term impact of puberty blockers. To kind of understand the wider implications of the Bell-Tavistock case, it's necessary to consider how the issue of consent and competence is approached by medical and family law in Britain. As a starting point, it's generally considered that under 18s lack decisional competence in medical matters. However, the Family Law Reform Act of 1969 acknowledges that 16 to 17-year-olds should be treated as adults regarding their capacity to consent to medical treatment. Furthermore, Gillick versus West Norfolk and Wisbeck posited that in the case of children under the age of 16, a minor will be able to consent to treatment if they demonstrate sufficient understanding and intelligence to enable him or her to understand fully what is proposed. And this is referred to as Gillick competence, a term you might have seen if you've been reading the news about it. The law has therefore generally approached competence as something to be determined on a person and decision-specific basis. And the court's decision to kind of define an entire category of people as universally incapable of giving informed consent is a very unusual one, and raised concerns not only about the rights of transgender children, but children in general. In its ruling, the court thus effectively singled out gender non-conforming youth and gender-affirming healthcare as a unique case that requires different measures that consent in the context of other types of healthcare. In this paper, I analyzed the underlying logic and conditions that allowed the court to arrive at this unusual decision. Much of the defense of Tavistock was based on arguing for the very real consequences and the intense suffering caused by gender dysphoria. However, as I will show, it was the very nature, roots, and meaning of this suffering that became contested in court in a way that ultimately worked against Tavistock. I argue that an emphasis on suffering undermined the defendant's case and was turned against them in court. The claimants were able to both appropriate the moral justification of alleviating suffering and protecting vulnerable children, as well as challenge the epistemological status of the knowledge and expertise of the defendants. The court case thus became both an epistemological and moral attack on the basic assumptions of the suffering paradigm. When this case landed in December 2020, I was kind of just starting my fieldwork on transgender politics and mental health in the UK, and the case and its aftermath quickly became kind of a central thread that I've been following in my research, because it's crystallizing some of the kind of key questions I have about the politics of trans suffering. It's one of the very few services worldwide providing treatment for under 18s, and GIDS is therefore kind of a key location for expertise on transgender youth and children. Importantly for my purposes, in its service specification, the GIDS states that the purpose of the clinic is to reduce the distressing feelings of a mismatch between their natal assigned sex and their gender identity. In other words, the primary goal of the treatment is not the prevention of pubertal development, but the alleviation of psychological suffering caused by this mismatch. And GIDS also does not only treat gender non-conforming children and their families, but produces its own research and data on trans youth and children. And it's kind of an active participant in the process of knowledge production on trans lives, and therefore represents an important site through which the suffering paradigm is enacted and an ideal case study for examining its effects on practice. I will examine 3 issues related to suffering in this case. First, I will look at questions of evidence and attempts to measure suffering and how this makes certain subjects and experiences invisible. Then how notions of suffering and happiness are themselves tied to normative assumptions about what constitutes happy, worthy lives, and can therefore be used to justify multiple interventions. And finally, how suffering is linked to gendered and racialized notions of vulnerability, producing homogeneous subjecthoods. Finally, I will argue that the suffering paradigm limits political solutions and trans futures. Okay, so starting with evidencing suffering. So one of the kind of key arguments that the claimants made was that there was no proper evidence of the efficacy of puberty blockers in improving psychosocial functioning. In making their case, a large proportion of the evidence provided by Tavistock Clinic to the court was regarding the nature of gender dysphoria as a legitimate condition and the intense distress of the youth seeking treatment. However, rather than directly denying the distress and existence of children with dysphoria, the claimants were successful in painting a picture of uncertainty around the issue by appealing to a lack of evidence and the controversial and experimental nature of the treatment. One of the key issues in the Bell versus Tavistock court case thus related to questions of proof and certainty. The question became what kind of knowledge is recognized as legitimate, and how might highly subjective experiences of suffering or its alleviation be turned into a form of evidence that can be recognized by the court. Kind of in practice, 2 requirements allow data to become good evidence according to the logic of modern evidence-based medicine, both of them problematic for the case of trans youth. First is the use of randomized controlled trials, meaning that studies incorporate an element of comparison between groups that receive and don't receive a particular treatment. The second way that this kind of evidence is constructed is through comparing and synthesizing large amounts of quantitative data through systematic review and meta-analysis. However, the requirement for large amounts of data to compare becomes problematic when the issue or population in question is marginal, either due to its rarity or lack of research interest and funding, and when the treatment is relatively new. This is a common situation for many treatments, but yet here in this context, this lack of data became a sign of the treatment being experimental in the case of puberty blockers. When asked by the court what evidence there was that puberty blockers did indeed achieve the purpose of alleviating distress, the defendants drew on the early intervention study conducted by Tavistock between 2011 and 2016, which, like most similar studies, did not involve a control group because of the ethical issues of not providing treatment to a group of young people. However, the study, which followed a group of 40 patients between the ages of 10 to 16 receiving puberty blocking treatment, recorded participant experience of treatment to be positive for the majority, with 100% of the young people stating they wanted to continue on blockers. In interviews, young people specifically reported feeling happier, feeling more comfortable, having better relationships with family and peers, and positive changes in gender role. A very similar message was shared in court by testimonies from former GIDS patients who felt they had really benefited from the treatment. But as pointed out by the claimants, the early intervention study somewhat paradoxically also states, using standardized measures, there were no differences between, I don't think I should be here yet. Yeah, so using standardized measures, there were no differences between baseline and later outcomes for overall psychological distress, as rated by parents and young people, nor for self-harm. In other words, when assessed through standardized questionnaires that use scales to rate the levels of psychosocial problems such as depression, self-harm, or suicidality, the psychological distress of young people did not change before, during, and after treatment. Standardized questionnaires such as depression scales are favored because they create a measurable and comparable form of knowledge, whereas the second, oh yeah, I think there's a little mix in the order. Yeah, this was the slide I was trying to get earlier. It's not updating here for some reason.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's delayed, yeah.
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so here we have kind of two different types of knowledge pitted against one another here, with the court choosing to place a higher value on one over the other. And I think what's interesting is that there's kind of a very this is a very similar argument that we saw in John Mayer's controversial paper that justified the closure of the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic in 1979, captured in this idea that treatment does not actually improve the lives of trans people. And importantly, this conclusion is drawn on the basis of these set external factors, whether it's issues of adjustment such as marriage or employment or psychiatric problems or depressive symptoms, regardless of how an individual person themselves perceives their situation and whether they are happy with the treatment. And what is noteworthy about this narrative is that it effectively excludes the experiences of trans individuals themselves from its notion of legitimate evidence. What is not discussed is whether the methods in question are in fact the most appropriate for understanding the experience of trans youth. Jack, a clinical psychologist at GIDS, remarks, kids could be having a hard time at school, have depression, and still feel like their life has improved. These are things that won't be easily measured. Jack notes transness requires a level of certainty that fits within specific narratives and binaries from young people. A person can be either completely sure or they must be confused. A person is fully happy or they must be suffering. A person is trans or a person is cis. There is never any space for ambiguity. Furthermore, the idea that one can neatly measure and draw a line between, for example, distress directly related to gender identity, suffering caused by prior trauma, and negative effects sparked by various forms of structural issues, and that this delineation is necessary for legitimizing trans suffering as a separate, recognizable entity, enacts its own forms of violence and exclusion. As Jack points out, the paradox is that while this narrative expects a performance of a certain kind of distress from a young gender non-conforming client, it can also make it more difficult to express other types of suffering, as the wrong kind of anxiety might be taken as problematic ambivalence about one's gender. By virtue of this logic, the more intersecting causes of suffering, Jack says, the person has, the harder they must struggle for their trans suffering to be recognized. In practice, this means that people with no trauma, whether that's individual trauma or systemic trauma, and other mental health issues, who are more likely to come from white middle-class backgrounds, are more likely to receive a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. It also makes sense that puberty blockers would not remove all of these different sources of distress, something not captured by questionnaires. how might one go about measuring the effect of puberty blockers in these cases, and what might be left uncaptured by such attempts? However, the court ruling also did not only discount the subjective experiences of trans youth themselves, but also clinical opinion and expertise within Tavistock, as well as the wider medical support and consensus for the use of puberty blockers in treating gender dysphoria by major organizations of transgender health, endocrinology, and pediatric endocrinology in the UK and globally. In addition to disputing the methods of research of the defendants, the claimants successfully promoted the idea that Gibbs has abandoned objective neutral science in favor of a political ideology that trumps clinical need. And such accusations had been ongoing already before the court case, made on the basis of dangerous influence from external parties, which critics perceived to have led to a shift to a more affirmative stance within the service during the 2010s. New relationships between Tavistock and trans rights organizations such as Mermaids, a charity that exists to support transgender children and young people and their families, prompted Stephanie Davis-Arai, founder of Transgender Trend, to argue Tavistock were ideologically captured. These assumptions were mirrored in the court case. No transgender rights organizations were invited to give testimonies, while the anti-transgender organization Fair Play for Women was welcomed by the court. Ultimately, when it comes to evidence, the court sided with the claimants in calling into question not only the use of puberty blockers, but the entire epistemic status of the gender clinic and the wider system it is part of. Jung describes an instant in which the trans status of him and another colleague was leaked to anti-trans groups, leading to online hate and abuse being directed at them. The idea was very much that someone like me should not be working here, that I would be pressuring kids to identify the way I do, but no one is saying that cis clinicians are pressuring kids to be cis. The presence of the trans clinician who embodies a dangerous subjectivity is thus seen as a contamination in the neutral space of the clinic. In other words, because transness is seen to exist outside and in opposition to the clinical space, the presence of trans bodies becomes a direct threat to the clinic's objectivity. So rather than a collapse of scientific expertise as whole per se, in the Kirwell case, we can see certain forms of expertise and facts becoming both contaminated and contaminating. As later pointed out by the Court of Appeal, the expert evidence and statements that were provided by the claimants were actually of poor quality and served at the last minute and did not comply with the rules regarding the use of expert evidence in courts. And yet these were taken kind of seriously, and not similar issues were brought up regarding this evidence. So it's kind of a twofold argument that I'm making here in this part. So first, attempts to measure suffering and fit it into particular standards of evidence can only recognize some forms of suffering while making others invisible, hiding from the view subjects who don't fit into the neat binary such narratives demand. Ultimately, such attempts to make suffering intelligible just reduce the complexity of lived experience and conceal power. And second, there's something here that I think we see in the TERF movement everywhere, and with this idea that we live in a post-truth era. In their book about TERFism, Ruth Pierce argues that anti-transgender politics cannot be understood separate from epistemological questions, where liberal notions of progress are dislocated and conventional notions of expertise and the epistemic status of facts break down. In other words, contestation over what counts as facts and objectivity stands at the heart of anti-trans politics. So we are seeing over and over again this failure of facts and research in bringing about change. Soon after this court landed, an activist working close to the case described to me the state of advocating for trans rights in the UK. It just feels like we are stuck. And this is the point that I will return to at the end of the presentation. So if I've now talked about the kind of problems with trying to measure and codify transgender suffering in a way that would make it intelligible or understandable, I now turn to the notion of how psychosocial functioning, or of being happy, can itself become a form of social control by defining subjects as always failing to reach the right level of happiness or desire the right things. It is therefore not only the measuring of suffering that proves problematic, but also the ways in which suffering or happiness themselves are understood and linked to certain normative expressions that progress in a linear, predictable manner. To be happy is as much about being a particular kind of subject, making particular kind of choices, than it is about any internal state of well-being. By suffering, the trans person fails to be happy, that is, to fail to be the right kind of subject. I will now recount the story of Diane and her 16-year-old son David to illustrate how an imperative to prevent suffering can become a basis for multiple interventions, justifying steering young people towards certain kind of lives and futures. The rhetoric around trans youth very much paints an image of unhappy, bullied teens isolated from their peers and psychologically stagnant. Being trans becomes synonymous with being unhappy, unnormal. This is kind of, again, reflecting kind of a key tenet in wider anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. And there's like similarities to kind of the argument that children shouldn't be taught about homosexuality, or if children become gay, then they will have these miserable lives that they need to be protected from. This is a logic that Sarah Ahmed calls the trope of the unhappy queers, which is the idea that queer lives will always end in tragedy, and the very misery of queerness becomes used as an argument against it. So Diane and I, we met on a cold December morning on Zoom, her in her home in southern England, me at my mother's place in Finland for holidays. Diane and David are waiting to receive a private prescription for hormones, which should arrive just in time for Christmas. Going private was not something she envisioned what they would do 5 years ago when they initially saw the referral to GEDS. What surprised me the most at the time was that I thought we would have to fight to convince them, but everyone believed us, everyone wanted to help David. The fact that the clinicians they met with clearly empathized with David's distress and acknowledged the need for treatment made the long and often traumatizing process that followed harder to comprehend. Over Zoom, Diane recounts the steps they had to take over the years. By the time David turned 16, the minimum age required to access hormones, GEDS had still not offered David any treatment. In the latest appointment with GEDS, David and Diane had discovered that before accessing hormones, David would need to first do a 12-month blocker treatment preceded by a 12-month wait period. In practice, this meant that David would not be able to receive hormone treatment before turning 18 and being transferred to adult services. Furthermore, David was asked to undergo a physical examination to assess the extent of puberty, something particularly uncomfortable for David due to sensory issues linked to his autism and his experience of strong body dysmorphia. Diane says, "We have waited and waited and waited. And then on his 16th birthday, the very people that are supposed to help say you need to go in there, put this stupid gown on and come out in front of these people, but you're not getting any treatment. We're going to make you wait another year and we're going to humiliate you to make you do these things that we know are impossible for you." There's a tension between the acceptance of gender dysphoria as a legitimate condition in need of treatment and a process that makes assessing it as difficult as possible. To make children and young people go through a distressing and sometimes dehumanizing process is justified because the choice they are making is perhaps seen as the wrong one, leading to even worse things in the future. This temporal dimension, the happiness that is at risk is always in the future, is made clear in the ruling. The court states that the adolescents at GEDS find it difficult to contemplate or comprehend what their life will be like as adults. It is the potential future regret of having undergone treatment that becomes a powerful impetus to protect children. In other words, the case sees the potential future suffering trump over present actual distress. In the ruling, the court echoes these concerns. It is necessary to have regard to matters which are those which objectively ought to be given weight in the future, although the child might be unconcerned about them now. On the facts of this case, there are some obvious examples, including the impact on fertility and on a future sexual functioning. What underlies this concern is the assumption of the naturalness of the desire to have biological children, especially for people who were assigned female at birth. Diane explains how David was repeatedly asked about his views on having children in the future and prompted to sign a series of documents. According to Diane, mothers with trans daughters reported no such pressure placed on their children. Future infertility is painted as a key obstacle to a happy future and that young people thus need to be protected from. Second, the court is concerned that young people will miss a period of normal biological, psychological, and social experience through adolescence. What exactly counts as normal experience of adolescence, and why is this biologically determined through the physical changes of puberty? What is left unsaid here are the heteronormative and allonormative assumptions that young people will want certain kinds of gendered, romantic, and sexual relationships. Furthermore, the court suggests that puberty blockers make young people more likely to proceed to transition. The suggestion here is that if someone like David would just live as a normal teenager with particular kind of experiences, he would grow up to become the right kind of subject, a normal cisgendered adult who desires a family and biological children. Puberty blockers, therefore, are seen not to only have the power to stop the physical changes of puberty, but to carry the risk of irrevocably shaping the kind of subject a young person becomes. Ultimately, the idea of regret in the Bell case is less about finding the most fulfilling life for an individual, but about the loss of what one should have desired in the first place, the loss of one's cisness, a normal youth, and a normal family. It is the loss of the opportunity to live a normal life, a happy life. This is why potential regret over not transitioning or the irreversibility of going through puberty are never considered to be an issue. Diane believes the question of whether blockers would have made someone like her son happy is the wrong one. The blockers were never going to fix things. Blockers don't actually give these kids what they want. It's just a pause to make things easier in the future. According to Diane, what they would have given David was a sense of being listened to and a sense of agency, like he was doing something to move towards his goals. To alleviate suffering or improve psychosocial functioning was secondary. I think human beings can cope with a lot when there is purpose, a sense of things improving. It was the utter purposelessness of what he was being asked to do that was the hardest. For her, she wanted David to be taken seriously, to be trusted to understand his own life and for his needs to be respected. Ultimately, everybody does things that they may later regret, but who would want to give away the right to make those choices? At the very end of our interview, Diane tells me the story that's in quotations here. The happiness encompassed by this trip to the Turkish barbers in Scotland is not part of any linear journey into a set kind of future. It's also not a happiness that requires the absence of suffering for its existence. So when the legitimacy of one's identity and rights is based on the subjective notion of suffering, the alleviation of suffering, by whatever means defined as the most efficient, can function as the basis for the justification of various interventions. And when stories such as David circulate in the media, they tend to locate the source of suffering in the transgender body, separating the inner experience of distress from the social context in which such experience is always located. When suffering is seen as interior to individuals, it excludes the very institutions that produce particular ideas of suffering. By focusing all attention on puberty blockers, whether the presumed solution is their absence or presence, this logic obscures the ways in which the very institutions and processes tasked with caring for children can inflict harm upon the subjects. Instead of addressing structural and institutional conditions that trans youths such as David are entangled in, the goal becomes making unsuffering subjects by promoting certain kind of outcomes in line with dominant understandings of the good life, while any failure to desire these things is constructed as pathological. How am I with time? I mean,
10 minutes?
yeah, that's really fine.
If you need it.
Yeah, I think 10 will be fine. Then final point I'm making about this case is around vulnerability. And how the court case kind of mobilized ideas of vulnerability that produced homogeneous subjecthood by linking transness to universal vulnerability and suffering. In arguing that under-16s were inherently incapable of giving informed consent, the court made a decision that was highly unusual from a legal perspective. The law has generally avoided defining entire categories of people as inherently vulnerable. To understand why trans adolescents were made into an exceptional category, it is necessary to have a closer look at the broader ideas of vulnerability underpinning the case that are involved in both sides. Importantly, while the claimants successfully used ideas of vulnerability to back the argument, young people are unable to give informed consent, trans rights defendants also tend to strategically draw on notions of vulnerability in an attempt to garner moral sympathies by presenting an image of children in need of protection. This shared understanding of vulnerability is rooted in the sociocultural imaginary of the Euro-American world and is particularly prominent in certain kind of feminist politics. First of all, this particular conception of vulnerability here is equated with susceptibility to harm, a condition of weakness and dependency, passivity, powerlessness. The court is particularly concerned by two statistics frequently emphasized by Transgender Trend. First, they note that over the past few years, the gender split in the clinic has drastically changed from 50-50 in 2011 to a situation where 79% of the adolescents treated at GIDS in 2019 were assigned female at birth. Second, they draw attention to the fact that a significant proportion of those presenting with gender dysphoria have a diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder. It is worth asking why these two demographics are highlighted as particularly important. After all, the court did not ask for an explanation about why the majority of patients are white or any other similar matter. In their statement, Transgender Trend directly argues the court should be anxious to ensure that vulnerable children, for example, those with ASD, are provided with the full protection of the law. Second, in this idea of vulnerability, it's seen as a fixed property pertaining to certain individuals and groups and not others, and this attribution of vulnerability is distributed hierarchically. These notions of vulnerability and victimhood are intrinsically linked with gender, race, and class, which become the defining factors of the ascription of vulnerability. This division of the population into more or less vulnerable subjects and populations is a common pattern of anti-transgender movements. The feminist writer Alison Phelps has argued that the effective landscape of such politics is connected both to the idea of the wounded self and the power of the state, which is summoned to help against the dangerous subject defined through its opposition to white middle-class womanhood. Therefore, when trans advocates use claims of vulnerability and suffering to back up claims for equality, they enter a terrain of competing victimhoods where certain bodies are already marked as more or less susceptible to harm and others as more or less dangerous. Third, when vulnerability is understood as a fixed, immutable property, the underlying assumption is that vulnerability means the same thing for all those deemed vulnerable. Writing about anti-violence activism, Sarah Lamble notes how transgender bodies are universalized along a singular identity plane of victimhood and rendered visible primarily through the violence that is acted upon them. Similarly, when appealing to the mental health vulnerability of trans people, we tell wounded stories which inadvertently assume that one, all trans people are equally vulnerable and susceptible to mental health issues, and that two, gender identity is always the most relevant part of a person's experience of victimization. Shared vulnerability thus becomes the basis for a homogeneous identity that erases other aspects of a person's life and identity. However, psychological distress experienced by transgender people is necessarily a heterogeneous experience shaped by race, class, gender, and sexuality, as well as by different social and relational experiences and other things not directly related to identity. By repeatedly telling a story where all trans people are equally susceptible to mental health issues and that they are caused primarily by being transgender, trans rights advocates therefore not only construct a vulnerable identity, but inadvertently make invisible other experiences and dynamics. By presenting psychological distress as primarily caused by factors related to gender identity, it becomes separate from rather than intertwined with material conditions and obscures other forms of oppression. The court ruling thus both relies on and produces a homogeneous subjecthood that links transness to suffering and universal trans vulnerability. In attempting to mobilize shared understandings of vulnerability and victimhood for their cause, trans activists enter a contested terrain that works against them because vulnerability and victimhood have always already been defined a priori in gendered, racialized, and class terms. Then for conclusions. So I have in this presentation used the Bell Tavistock court case to illustrate some of the unintended consequences of what I call the suffering paradigm, showing how it results in the production of homogeneous identities, obscuring intersectional factors, and making certain subjects and experiences invisible. The underlying ontology of suffering in this conceptualization is understood in individual terms, a human interiority which has become aligned with the particular notions of the mind or the brain. Second, it is based on a positivist understanding of suffering as something that can be measured, assessed, and quantified. Third, it draws on a rational approach to suffering as something negative that should be eliminated. This individualized, identity-based notion of suffering promotes a particular form of politics that is compatible with the liberal state and thus also shapes the potential scope of solutions and wider political imaginations, something I speak more in my wider research. Firmly rooted in the liberal logic of rationality and progress, the solution to the problem of trans suffering tends to be state recognition and protection of trans individuals, legal gender recognition, anti-discrimination and anti-hate crime provisions, and trans-specific healthcare, often at the expense of wider material inequalities. Ultimately, what becomes obscured is the possibility of different kinds of trans lives and futures. In the words of Jose Munoz, when activism gets stuck in defending the present, gridlocked in the totalizing reality of the here and now, it becomes hard to imagine trans futures beyond what we've already seen, to think and feel at there and then. When trans lives are only intelligible through present suffering, it becomes difficult to imagine trans possibilities beyond the parameters of what we already know. I approach all of these questions in a context where anti-trans sentiment has significantly intensified over the past 7-8 years in the UK, as I'm sure you are all aware. In the annual index of LGBTQ+ rights in Europe, ILGA Europe cites anti-trans policies and rhetoric as a key reason behind the UK's ranking plummeting more drastically than any other nations in the post-2016 period. This anti-trans backlash of the post-Brexit era had mainly focused on the fraud attempts to reform the Gender Recognition Act and the unrelated issue of single-sex spaces. The Bell case, therefore, was the latest in what is a long list of attempts to curtail transgender rights in the UK, and I argue it is illustrative of a wider collapse of liberal logic and politics. The failure of the suffering paradigm is both a moral and epistemic failure, calling for a new form of politics. And to finish, I'd like to return to that feeling of being stuck that the activist told me that I mentioned earlier. Further referring to the court case, the activist continued, we can show them all the research, all the experts are backing us up, and yet they will say we are distorting the truth, that we are the ones lying. What seemed the most incomprehensible to the activists I spoke was this failure of research and facts to convince the people in power in the same way that they had in the past. However, what I would like to suggest to finish with is that perhaps the sense of stuckness can also open up a potentiality for moving differently, that perhaps suffering here could also be productive of possibility. The opening up of possibilities for different kind of openings, not in the form of progress or inclusion, but rather a sideways movement. I suggest that it's precisely this sense of stuckness that characterizes transgender rights and citizenships today that might open the potentiality for moving differently. And that's it.
So I just want to wrap up with a few words to say that the Chair in Transgender Studies does all kinds of programming throughout the year, and we are doing this in support of trans plus people and our allies who are searching to find out the kind of interesting information about the community that you've seen in today's talk, and also learning about what's going on today and what's going on in the past and about our history. Please help us to continue to do this important work. And contrary to what many people think, this is not an endowed chair. Our survival depends on donations from you and from the goodwill of the University of Victoria. So if you are able, please donate now. You've got up on your screen. You can scan the QR code. There's a link in the chat if you want to use that to go online to donate. And if you're not able to donate at this time, maybe sometime in the future, and talk to your friends who have money and tell them that they should donate. Thank you all for attending, and we'll see you soon, I hope.